Later, some of the Noldor went to Eregion, upon the west of the Misty Mountains, and near to the west gate of Moria. This they did because they learned that Mithril had been discovered in Moria. The Noldor were great craftsmen, and less unfriendly to the dwarves than the Sindar, but the friendship that grew up between the people of Durin and the elven smiths of Eregion was the closest that there has ever been between the two races. Hey everyone, Ost-in here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we'll be discussing the land of Eregion, home of the elven crafters who learned ringcraft from Sauron. For more info, please check out the links in the description and cards. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. Eregion, meaning Land of Holly, named also Hollenland or Hollin for short by men, was indeed known for its holly trees. Being west of the Misty Mountains in Khazad-dûm, north of the rivers Glandwin and Siranon, east of the Brunnian, and south of the Trollshaws, Eregion was rather uninhabited until the Second Age. I wouldn't be surprised if kin of the Edain, perhaps those related to the Dunlendings, lived there originally in the First Age, however. Now in the Second Age, the last known surviving descendant of Feanor, Celebrimbor, who was the son of Curufin, would leave Lindon with some Noldor elves and found the elven settlement in Eregion, with the capital Ost-in-Edhil, meaning Fortress of the Eldar, being established in 750. It's possible, as some sources state, that Galadriel and Celeborn, who would come from Evendim to Eregion around this time, founded Ost-in-Edhil, or even led the elves here. Yet it is my belief based on other sources that Celebrimbor, who was the Lord of Eregion, founded the capital, and Celeborn and Galadriel did come to live in Eregion for a time soon after. Eventually, Galadriel would leave Eregion between 1350 and 1400, going through Khazad-dûm to Lorinand, later named Lothlorien with her daughter, and Celeborn remained behind due to his enmity with the dwarves and not wanting to deal with them in going through their kingdom. I would imagine that Celebrimbor was still subservient to High King Gil-galad in Lindon overall, yet was left to his own devices to run things in Eregion. This would be in line with how the Sons of Feanor were left to rule their own realms during the First Age, yet they were still under the greater command of the High Kings of the Noldor. However, Celebrimbor, like and unlike his grandfather Feanor, wished to craft rather than to wield political power, and so it was the promise of Mithril in Khazad-dûm that drew him and his folk there. Since these were mostly Noldor, they were great crafters, and rather than disputing with the dwarves, they actually came to admire and respect Durin's folk of Khazad-dûm, living in friendship with them as trading partners. Eregion and Khazad-dûm would foster the closest of friendships between dwarves and elves until at least Legolas and Gimli. The Noldor craftsmen of Ost-in-Edhil formed the guise, the people of the jewelsmiths, which was a brotherhood of craftsmen, and they built wondrous things of beauty, the greatest works of the Noldor since the time of Feanor. One such project would be the Doors of Durin, crafted by Celebrimbor and the dwarf Narvi, sometime between 750 and 1500. These doors were often open in those days, yet many friends of the dwarves among the elves surely knew the password to get in. Yet knowledge of Eregion traveled in all directions, and eventually this land and its crafters became known to Sauron, who himself once served Aule the Vala, and was a great craftsman himself, thus taking on a fair form and the guise of Annatar, an emissary of the Valar. He went to the ring crafters, not being welcomed by Gil-galad in Lindon. As this Lord of Gifts, Annatar began to teach the Gwaith y Myrdain in 1200 of the Second Age. He taught them how to forge rings of power, some lesser, and later ones greater. In around 1500, the greater 16 rings were forged, 9 which would be for men and 7 for dwarves. Sauron would depart from Eregion, and still Celebrimbor forged. He alone made 3 rings, untouched by Annatar, and these would be the Elven rings, made in 1590. However, in 1600 of the Second Age, Sauron, who had returned to Mordor, finished crafting his 1 ring in Mount Doom, and so learning of the secret 3 Elven rings, he set to work building an army to invade Eregion and all of Eriador. The elves who wore the Rings of Power heard Sauron's voice, and taking the rings off as to not be dominated, they realized that they had been deceived. The 9 rings, and most likely the 7 as well, stayed in Eregion, but the more powerful 3 rings, those for which Celebrimbor cared most, were sent away, given to Galadriel, who bore and protected Nenya, and Gil-galad, and maybe also Círdan the Shipwright at this time, who took Vilya and Narya, but it could be that Gil-galad took both. Regardless, in 1693 the War of the Elves and Sauron began, and eventually Sauron's forces would go to invade Eregion through Calenarthon. Gil-galad would send Elrond and many elves to Eregion, but Sauron's forces got there first. The ring crafters would not give up the rings of power, and so Sauron invaded. Celeborn's forces would be pushed back, and Sauron's forces laid waste to Eregion, killing many Noldor and breaking Ost-in-Edhil. The 9 rings would be captured, and Celebrimbor would be tortured into revealing the location of the 7. But he would never give up the 3, for they were dear to him. Thus Celebrimbor was slain, the body of the Lord of Eregion being used as a banner for evil. Sauron guessed where the 3 rings were, and who they were who guarded them. Celeborn's forces would meet with Elrond's, and together they were pushed back into the Trollshaws, and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm sealed the doors of Durin. Although Sauron would eventually be defeated with the help of the Númenóreans, Eregion, much like many elven lands of the Elder Days, was ruined beyond recompense. Rivendell, founded shortly after Eregion's fall, would fulfill the former role that Eregion itself had once played, and it would be the northeastern stronghold of the Elves in Eriador. Likely some ring-lore and lost relics of Eregion would be recovered and placed in Rivendell, but what was lost could never be regained. The ruins of Eregion were left to be, and travelers would pass through the land feeling its emptiness. The river Siranon would dry, as the pool of water outside of the doors of Durin formed a dam in the river, and the Watcher in the Water came to reside there. Eventually, in 3019 of the Third Age, Eregion would see important characters in its land once again, as the Fellowship of the Ring passed through here. In a land which once saw friendship between dwarves and elves, heard the bickering of Gimli and Legolas, who became best friends soon after. Once a land of elves, now had many wolves, some of which attacked the Fellowship who could not pass over the mountains. Eventually they went through Moria, Khazad-dûm of old, but after figuring out the password of the doors of Durin, of course, something which was probably once widely known to the elves of Eregion. For just as the friendship between elves and dwarves had faded, so too had its memory, as illustrated in theme by the riddle on the doors. The Watcher in the Water would attack the Fellowship, shutting and damaging the doors behind them with rock, which would likely be repaired at some point in the future. Later that same year, some remaining members of the White Council, along with the 4 hobbits of the Fellowship, came to Eregion, and it seems like one of, if not the last meeting of the White Council took place in or near Eregion. While elves would never return there, and dwarves who later retook Moria in the Fourth Age would repair the border of their kingdom and Eregion, the ruins of this land would remember the jewelsmiths who had fashioned some of the last great works of the elves in Middle-earth, and those who had friendship with the dwarves. Although it became a place of sorrow and memory, and perhaps that was the reason why it was never rebuilt, as to memorialize all that had happened, Eregion would nevertheless be an important place in the history of Middle-earth, and emblematic of the history of some of the elves of Arda at large, who passed from this world in later days. And so we come to the end of our tale on Eregion, land of the ring crafters. From the tale of Eregion, we see that we must be wise in the ambitions of our hearts and minds, for promises that seem too good to be true just might be, as these elves learned too late about Annatar. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this Region Spotlight. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts on Eregion? Let me know in the comments below. While it becomes a place of sorrow, I am quite fascinated by the obscure lore and land of Eregion and city of Ost-in-Edhil, especially for the greater roles such places played in the making of the rings that affected the history of the rest of the world. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons, Kyle Wetzel, Peter Shepard, Jonathan Putnam, Mark Kralik, Blair Scouten, Merton, John Hume, Sam McBee, Matt Sabatch, Elizabeth Calvert, Maz Gibbs, Reese Jenkins, Anna Petrlik, Brandon Glidden, Molly Sullivan, Daniel Burns, Anthony Harmon, Dorwin Gray, Arthur, and Merlin. Thank you so much, and thanks to all of our patrons and YouTube members. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. I'll see you all again next week with an epic character history on Theodred, Prince of Rohan. You all are the best, my friends. Thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.